Hello, Rupert. Very nice to see you and to have the chance to speak with you.
Hello, Mark. Likewise, thank you for inviting me in. Very nice to be here with you.
I'm really glad to do so because I've been listening to a lot of your conversations and indeed been on retreats and very much appreciate how you are developing your teaching in dialogue with many people now. So hope that our conversation can contribute to that. But it's good to start with the place that perhaps we should start and finish at, which is the kind of teaching which you offer. And it's sometimes called the direct path. In more technical terms, it's sometimes called Advaita Vedanta. Maybe just to give this a bit of a twist, you sometimes remark that this direct path feels like one very much for now. And so I wonder if perhaps you could just say what the direct path is and then why perhaps its moment seems to be now as much as at any other time, or the particularities perhaps of why now.
Yes, the term "the direct path" is used in contrast to the indirect path or the progressive path, which is the more traditional approach. What does the direct path imply? It implies that we go directly to the reality or the essence of ourself without going indirectly or by stages. Now, we can explore this more during the conversation, but for the moment, let's just say that in this approach, the reality or the essence of our self is considered to be pure consciousness or ever-present, unlimited awareness. And it is possible, and particularly in this approach, it is considered possible for everybody without exception, to go in their experience directly to the reality of their own self or being, simply by virtue of the fact that everyone is aware. So irrespective of what we are aware of, that is, irrespective of the condition of our thoughts, memories, feelings, relationships, activities, and so on, we are aware of them. And that awareness remains constant, unchanged throughout all changing experience. And it is possible to go directly, to take a step back, as it were, from the content of our experience and go directly back to our essential self or being, namely the presence of awareness. Now, in the more traditional approaches, which are sometimes referred to as the indirect path or the progressive path, this step back from the content of experience in the foreground, namely our thoughts, feelings, relationships, and so on, to the background or essence of pure awareness was considered to be too radical a step, too big a step for most people to take in one go. And therefore, an intermediary step or numerous intermediary stages were placed in between. And these steps or stages involved practices that really purified and refined the mind until it was of its accumulated tension, dispersal, anxiety, until it was considered sufficiently stable and sufficiently mature to be able to sink directly into its source or essence. And typically these intermediary steps or stages would be the focusing of attention on a mantra, a flame, the breath, the pause between breaths, the teacher, an image. These were, there are various steps, either physical or mental, that brought about this stabilizing and purifying of the mind, as I say, before it was considered sufficiently mature to take this final plunge, this final step back into the fact of simply being aware or awareness itself. Now, I would suggest, and many others have done so before me, that these intermediary steps are not necessary. It is possible for, let's say, for almost everybody. We'll perhaps touch later on why I don't say everybody, but in theory, everybody, but in practice, almost everybody, to go directly to the simple fact of being aware without having to deal with the content of the mind and the body on the way. And I feel that this our age, our era, is one in which people are now sufficiently mature psychologically and intellectually to be able to be able to understand that whatever they are aware of, they are aware. Awareness is present, and to be able to go directly to that experience, the experience of being aware, without the need for any intermediary. Not least because so many of the old religious and traditional methods have not, I feel, and I think many people feel, have not been updated sufficiently by our culture to remain relevant to our culture. And therefore, many people just simply cannot relate to the ideas that are contained in the ideas and practices that are contained in these traditions.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I sometimes think of it as we modern people have a very powerful sense of our individuality, perhaps more so than perhaps most people in history, maybe all, but certainly we value that. But it can be interpreted in separate, autonomous, alienated ways, as if we're splendidly walking through our individual life, hitting each other like billiard balls on occasion. But whilst that clearly can precipitate all sorts of troubles with life, there is a kind of upside to it, which is that it is possible perhaps to take the steps which you're outlining there, of quickly and directly becoming aware of the presence within which or from which our individuality arises, because there is this powerful sense of individuality.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
that makes some sense.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, that makes some sense to you.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right that our sense of individuality, which we refer to as I, is both the cause of our anxieties, our fears, our sorrows, both the cause of our suffering, but it is also the doorway or the portal into our salvation, to use the Christian term. So it is both that which causes our suffering in the first place, but as you rightly say, it is also the key to the remedy for our suffering, and in this way, that if we conceptualize suffering, all our suffering, by saying, I am upset, I am lonely, I am anxious, I am depressed. So there's always an I or a self, our individual self, that stands at the heart of our suffering, around whom all our suffering revolves. This sense of being a separate I is the cause of our suffering. However, it is also the remedy, in the sense that if we cease paying attention to our anxiety, our fear, our depression, our loneliness, and we investigate the self, the I, on whose behalf our suffering arises, that apparently separate self is the portal through which we pass in our investigation on our way back, so to speak, to our discovery of our true self, the true self, which is utterly intimate, but at the same time impersonal. And that discovery is the resolution of our suffering.
I wonder if we should just check that presence now almost. And if I put this to you, that can show up, that presence of awareness can show up when we think about how we speak, even together now. As it were, I am here, you are where you are. Maybe the people who are listening in are where they are. And yet there's also the shared sense of a collective, you might say, space or consciousness, almost like a third that appears when two or more are gathered together, to again use a slightly Christian phrase. And that, when you pay attention to that, starts showing up, having these qualities of awareness that you often talk about. So one can feel it even in the conversation right now.
Yes, yes. If both you, in fact, both you and I, Mark, but also everyone who is listening or will listen to this conversation, if we were all now to describe what we are aware of, we would all describe something different. Our thoughts and feelings would be very different from one another. The perception of each of our rooms would be very different. The sound of our voices would be similar because everyone's hearing the same voice. But what we describe would vary enormously. However, if each of us were to turn our attention around, so to speak, and look at, I don't literally mean look at, but to become aware of not what we are aware of, but to become aware of that which is aware. And we were to describe that, we would all describe it in exactly the same terms. In other words, the fact of being aware is the only experience that is identical to everyone. And if we begin to, if we first recognize that the fact of being aware or the presence of awareness, and we then begin to recognize not only its presence, but we begin to explore its qualities. Okay, for instance, can we find its limits? We find limits to everything that we are aware of. But if we go to the pure experience of simply being aware, we find no limits there. And in this way, we begin to intuit that although the fact of being aware, our essential self or being, is utterly intimate, it is the innermost aspect of ourself, it does not share the limits of the mind or the body. It is unlimited, and ultimately it is shared. It's at the very deepest, at our core, we are not a similar being, but the same being. And I would suggest that that's what the experience of love is. That love is literally the recognition that at the deepest level we are one. Being is not really our being. A being doesn't belong to a person or a body or a mind. Being is that shared reality from which all people, minds, indeed all things, derive their apparently independent existence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder about another take on the direct path and now, which makes a lot of sense to me, which, as you sometimes put it, awareness of this shared being that belongs to no one but belongs to all, is in a way the first chapter in the book of aligning with this awareness, with the rebirth, you might even say, after yes. After the recognition of it. And I like that because I think that there is a lot of confusion around, actually. You see it in mental health. I mean, I work as a psychotherapist. You see it in domains like that, but quite generally with this sort of supernova almost of teaching that is available online and elsewhere now about what things like awakening or enlightenment are. And it makes a lot of sense to me to say, look, this actually is the most intimate, imminent experience, but actually quite ordinary too.
Yes.
But when it's turned to, as you say, when you sink into it and then almost re-emerge from it or with it, life changes. And that, in a way, is where the action's at.
Yes.
That's what makes the difference. That's where the journey almost begins. So it almost reverses what you often hear.
Yes.
The years. Well, yeah.
Exactly. I think this recognition, the suggestion that the recognition of the nature of ourself is simply the end of the first chapter in a book of many chapters. I think I first formulated this in response to not only a misunderstanding that I had, but a misunderstanding that I noticed that many people who came to my early meetings and retreats also had, namely that enlightenment was this extraordinary, one, that it was an extraordinary experience, and two, that it was really the end of the path. And I feel very differently about that now, namely that it is just the end of one stage of the path, but there's a whole process that comes after that, which I sometimes refer to as the alignment process, the process by which, the means by which we realign our thoughts and feelings, and in time our activities and relationships with this new understanding. And that realignment process, I don't think we can really ever say that it comes to an end. I think the body-mind, it's referred to, I think, in the Christian tradition, traditionally as the transfiguration. It's the transfiguring of everything about our limited individuality at the level of the body and the mind, the transfiguring of the individual with, in traditional language, the light of God's being, the presence of awareness, and the realignment of our thoughts and feelings and the way we act and relate in the world.
And to take it even a step further and think about what that might mean in the world, I'm also struck that it feels like you sometimes make the comment that this could be a Copernican revolution in our times. And I then go to what are the very pressing problems of our times, which are evident to many now, and what difference that might make. And I get drawn to it because actually, as a book I was recently reading by Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who I regard as one of the great spiritual teachers of our time, he made this remark that it feels like we're in a moment that doesn't need sort of stronger ethics or greater imperatives and demands made upon us, but we actually need a conversion or an epiphany, a kind of awakening, to use that mix of words, that will almost reset or help us, our culture, to be reborn. Now, no doubt that will happen in a myriad places and perhaps build to something, but it feels like there's something quite important here socially for us as well, and the pressing nature of our times.
Absolutely, absolutely. Think of let's leave aside the small scale conflicts that may exist in our individual lives or the families and local communities, but think of the large scale conflicts that we've witnessed over the last year or so. Think back to Afghanistan, the Israelis and the Palestinians. Think back to the bitterness and the hostility of the US election last year. Think of North Korea and South. There are so many examples of bitter conflicts on a large scale. Now, imagine what the impact on these conflicts would be if a single understanding were shared by all concerned, namely the understanding that at the deepest level, what we essentially are is the same. just that understanding. So I agree with Rowan Williams that we don't. It's a small understanding. Call it enlightenment, awakening. Call it epiphany. It's just understanding. Think of how these conflicts would evolve if the people that are at war with each other, that are in conflict with each other, began to understand and feel that the other, the enemy, was essentially their self, but beneath or behind the differing ideas. There will always be differing ideas. But if you just get two sets of ideas relating to each other, two sets of conditioning relating to each other, then conflict is the inevitable consequence of that. But if all parties concerned were able to see through the conditioning to the shared being, the being we share with the other behind that, then this understanding alone would be a Copernican revolution on a momentous scale.
I sometimes feel that the genius of systems like capitalism or materialism is that they have persuaded us that our happiness requires us to get something and to possess it, to hold on to it and secure it and so on. Whereas, of course, you know, what you're outlining and showing is precisely the opposite of that, that we have it already. The question is to discover it and manifest it.
Absolutely. This is you just mentioned really the second aspect of the great understanding that is expressed in all the religious and spiritual traditions. The first one, which we've touched on, namely that we share our being, that's the experience of love. And this relates to our external experience, that is our experience with others. But the understanding that you've just touched on relates to our internal experience, and namely that the happiness which everybody loves and seeks above all else is the very nature of ourself, that happiness lies within us. The kingdom of heaven lies within, in the Christian tradition. All the traditions state this in one way or another. So yes, these are the two. If we took 3,000 years of religious and spiritual teaching and distilled it into a single sentence, it would read, happiness is the nature of our being, and we share our being with everyone and everything. That's really it. If we as individuals and of course as communities and nations understood this, and our individual lives, but also our community life was based around these understandings, that would be a revolution. Literally, it would be a revolution.
Yeah, it would. I want about narrowing it in a little bit, and again, to come back to some of my own particular concerns, which is about the relationship between psychotherapy and this potential revolution, the spiritual traditions, which I completely agree with you. They've all had that at their heart. I've done quite a lot of work on Plato. It's there, as well as the Christian tradition. But maybe this is touching on what you were mentioning at the outset, which is about the preparation that in the ancient traditions, certainly say in the Upanishads, where it was said that you need to find a good teacher, but you need to develop a still mind too. Often those two things go together. And I wonder whether this has changed slightly in the modern world, or maybe substantially, but changed in the modern world anyway, which is that perhaps because of this powerful sense of individuality that we're born into now, it leads people vulnerable to what is often called trauma. And I'll just use that word, basically experiences in the past that overwhelm us. And so we can't absorb them, we can't integrate them into our sense of self. And so they repeat and knock around inside us and get triggered and so on. I'm sometimes drawn to the remark, I think made by the Dalai Lama actually, when he said that when he came to the West from the East, he found kinds of neurosis which didn't really exist in more traditional society where he came from, and maybe that's saying the same sort of thing. But anyway, the point would be that perhaps the relationship between psychotherapy and spirituality can be understood as psychotherapy almost being a kind of preparatory activity that brings the self together enough not to then say to it, off you go, lead a happy life, but so that then the individual can start to see the true ground of their individuality, so almost see around what they took to be their sense of self and discover the shared presence. So a sort of relationship, something like that, perhaps.
Yes, I think you're right, Mark. 100 years ago, well, let's go back to a bit further, let's say 200 years ago, and certainly the case if we were to go back further than that, the sense of individuality was not well enough developed in people for the sense of self to be something that one would focus on, as we do in the process of self-inquiry or self-investigation, which is really the essence of the direct path. There has to be a sense of self. There has to be a sense of I, the individual I, there has to be that sense of an individual I present in the first place for us to be able to explore it. 200 or 300 years ago, there wasn't a strongly enough developed sense of a separate self to be able to then explore it. So I think you're right. It is the possible, and of course therapy has developed in response to this highly developed sense of an individual self and the inevitable suffering on the inside and conflict on the outside that attends it. And in that sense, therapy, if skillfully used, can be, as you say, a prelude to this deeper inquiry into the essential nature of ourselves. But I think it can also be used, going back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation, it can also be used in chapters 2 onwards, where we have recognized our essential being and are attempting to align our thinking, feeling, acting, and relating with this new perspective of ourself. And so I think the therapeutic process also has a part to play after the recognition of our true nature, not just as a preparation for it.
Yeah, I like that thought a lot. It makes sense. It makes me think of, in the recovery of what would be called visionary or mystical traditions within Christianity, that I think is quite apace now. Figures like Evagrius Ponticus are being discovered, and the reason why he comes to my mind is because he describes what he called, I think it's in Greek, but it's something like the 8 serious thoughts or something like that, which he said, if you go into the desert, as he did in the 3rd and 4th centuries, and sit still, sure enough, the presence of God will show up, but so will what he called things like greed and lust and anger and vainglory. And what's so striking is, well, 2 things really. One is that a lot of modern psychotherapy has described similar serious thoughts that the work of therapy can be about. And the point is to go through them in a way and understand them more and more deeply, and then they're found to dissolve rather than shy from them and wish they weren't there. But also, and in a way hugely tragically, these 8 serious thoughts got turned into the 7 deadly sins that people felt were condemning them. And so if in the first instance, as a therapist, you say to someone, look, bring your anger here, it's already forgiven, but it's not fully understood, and that's what we can do. That's in a way converting the 7 deadly sins back to the 8 serious thoughts.
Absolutely.
Then maybe, as you're saying too, the 8 serious thoughts then sort of become the path as well, as the basic understanding percolates more and more throughout our being.
Exactly. We turn towards these afflictive emotions rather than turning away from them or escaping from them or into objects and substances or suppressing them. We turn towards them, and we are then able to trace our way back, all the way back through them to our essential being, which lies behind them. But yes, if there is a rejection of them, if we are escaping them through, first through judging them as sins, and then trying to go beyond them rather than go behind them, yes, that is, it just compounds the problem.
Yeah, you try and separate yourself internally, let alone from the rest of the world and others. Yeah. But we're touching on things Christian, and that's partly because I come from that tradition, broadly speaking. And I wonder if we could address that. You clearly talk about Indian traditions and Advaita Vedanta particularly, and often actually also refer to Sufi traditions, which I know is in your own past. And I wondered if I could try and put some insights from the Christian tradition to you and see how they sort of settle as well. Well, actually, one person you often cite in very beautifully is William Blake. And I made a note, this phrase which I've heard you say a few times, which is, how do you know that every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight enclosed by your senses five? So every bird that cuts the airy way is an immense world of delight. And that's speaking to this shared being. And I also like the quatrain, he who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is pure non-duality, and it's the essence of Christianity. So I'm interrupting you, Mark. Carry on, but yes, absolutely.
So I mean, to sort of tease that out, you mentioned also Jesus's remark about the kingdom of God being within you. I wonder if you could take it a step further, and what the death and resurrection of Jesus might mean, because I think for Christians, the teaching of Jesus is important, clearly. The moments in Jesus's life, such as the Transfiguration, are important too. But the thing that's really remembered is the death and the resurrection. And I wonder whether, have you ever, considered how that might make sense within non-duality as well?
Very much so.
Oh, good.
Very much so. Yes. Well, first of all, what does it mean? The kingdom of heaven is within us. What is, if we look inside of ourselves, what do we find? Well, the first thing we find are thoughts, images, feelings, and so on. But what if we keep on going back, if we trace our way back through the layers of experience, and we go as far as we can go, what's the bottom line? What's the primary experience that stands before all thoughts, images, feelings, and so on? It is just the knowledge of being, the awareness of being, which we express when we say simply, I am. If we were to ask anybody, not just those of us interested in these matters, but any of the almost 8 billion of us to describe their self, everyone would say, I am a man, I am a woman, I am a mother, I am a father, I'm 22 or 47, etc., etc., etc. Every statement would begin with the words, I am. And then that basic sense of self or being would be qualified by a thought, a feeling, an activity, a relationship, an age, etc. But the basic sense of self is the pure I am. Now, if we go in ourself to the pure sense of being, that to which we refer when we say I am, before it is qualified by experience, it is utterly intimate, but impersonal. It shares none of the limits of our personal experience. It is pure being, divested of the qualities that being acquires from the content of experience. And the nature of that being, being devoid of all objective qualities, its nature is peace, wholeness, fulfillment, commonly called happiness or joy. So I think what is meant by in the Christian tradition, by the crucifixion and the resurrection, it is the dying. It is a symbol of the dying to everything in ourself that is not essential to ourself. It is the death of the sense of being a temporary, finite, individual self. That's the first thing, the death of everything that seems to limit and qualify and condition us. That's the first thing, the death. And then the subsequent, it's actually simultaneous, but let's talk about it in time, the subsequent resurrection, the rebirth. It's not really a rebirth, but it's the emergence of the true self, the true infinite being that was there all the time, shining as our very own self, but because it was qualified by experience, was not fully known. It was only partially known. Hence this sense, I am an individual self. Well, if we remove all individual experience from the individual self, only the I am remains. And that I am, whilst being utterly intimate, is infinite. It is God's name. It is the presence of God within us. So the resurrection is the death of the apparently separate self, and the resurrection would be the emergence of the true self, God's being in religious terms, God's being, which is the being of all beings. And the symbolism of the resurrection, the crucifixion and the resurrection, and later the transfiguration, is a symbolic representation of this process.
Yeah, well, that makes lots of sense. And it's picked up in figures like Paul, who I think you can see almost in Paul's letters actually a sort of development where he's wrestling with this extraordinary realization that he's had and then trying to find ways of expressing it. But it comes to phrases like I no longer live, but Christ lives within me, or taking on the mind of Christ would be another phrase.
Exactly. These are phrases that point to exactly the same understanding, but of course languaged in a way that was consistent with the times in which they were spoken. That the language we have, when we hear these words now, we really have to translate them through what we know of the Christian tradition, but it's referring to exactly the same understanding. Yes, Christ was understood not as a person called Jesus. It was the Christ principle, the Christ consciousness, the knowledge I am, God's presence.
Yes, and I think also another angle on this is that, particularly I think for the historic great world religions, their founders, or the seminal figures, the sages and the saints, they are partly remembered, I think, because people saw this re-emergence, this process of dying and resurrection in their lives, and then they become the type that lead to a way that others follow. So, you know, it's very striking to me that the gospel accounts of the resurrection are quite bemusing in one way. You know, sometimes Jesus seems to eat, sometimes Jesus walks through walls, sometimes Jesus is walking alongside disciples and not being recognized. At other times, you know, he is recognized. And I think that must be something about almost their perception kind of adjusting to this new realization. Yeah.
Yes, because of course, Jesus was talking to people, like the vast majority of people, who have a very strong belief in themselves as an individual self. And they couldn't relate in their own experience directly to what he was speaking of. So they tended to, although what he was referring to was their very own being, because they felt their very own being was something temporary and finite, the only way they could really reconcile what he was saying was to project it onto him as a person. So when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, they thought that he was referring to himself as a person because they considered themselves to be a person. They didn't realize that he was talking about the experience I am, which is the name of God, the indication of God's presence. They didn't realize that they were talking about that the I am, that the pure knowledge I am is the way to God's presence. It is God's presence, and it is the way to God's presence. But it was projected because of this strong belief where I am a temporary, finite, separate person. Therefore, this understanding was projected onto him, and of course by subsequent generations. So then the person of Jesus becomes the focus for many people of this understanding. But he never drew attention to himself as a person. He was always drawing attention to the I am, to the Spirit, to the Father within him, and so on, which was just using the language of the day to try to indicate God's presence as his very own being.
Yeah, that reminds me of the resurrection incident when Thomas, doubting Thomas, finally adjusts and sees, and then says, "My Lord and my God." I think the "my" there too is his self-realization in that moment, and so sharing in that.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean these I am statements. They've got to be inclusive, not exclusive statements, because if you're a monotheist or you believe in the unity of the non-dual vision, everything must be within that, as it were. If it weren't, it would just fall out of existence altogether.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. Well, look, let me see, take it a step further, because another really important thing within the Christian tradition is the sense that God can be described as a Trinity. Now, this is, I think, widely misunderstood. You can often hear it talked about in Christianity as if it's sort of three persons that manage to get it together in a particularly beautiful way. But actually, I think what it's about, again, is a way of trying to talk about and so cultivate within yourself as well the experience of unity. And it can be seen to have, you might say, certain dynamics which can be sort of described distinctly, but without dividing from the unity. And so the three persons, if you get into theology, you sort of stop using the word person because it has these separate qualities, which you've been alluding to too. And those who have the Greek will talk about the hypostases instead, which can be even more confusing, but at least it is saying, look, we're trying to talk about divine life here, which we can know, not separate life, which we also know. But that it has qualities that, for example, what would be traditionally associated with the Son, with the Logos, of kenosis would be the word, which is this life that's known because it's this continual process of giving and receiving. It's a shared quality that gives birth to the unity. And then with the Spirit, the word that is often used is ecstasis, where we get the word ecstatic from, but I think that's a bit misleading too, because that suggests some peak exceptional experience, whereas really what it's saying is that when you reflect on your being, you realize that it's outside you as much as inside you. So ecstasis means to step out and to discover the inner life outside, if I can use a slightly paradoxical statement. But is that beginning to make some sense to you too, that this language of the Trinity evolved, I think, primarily to give expression to the fullness of the divine life, which is unified, but it's not a simple sort of collapse into a static singularity. Sometimes today, with the development of silicon chips, people hope there'll be the birth of a singularity where all will somehow be sucked into a unity, and that feels quite tyrannical, actually. And maybe even a bit dead. But the unity of these wisdom traditions I think has to incorporate the sense of dynamism and life, vitality, because after all, we're saying it's life. And the Trinity, perhaps there is one way of doing it, for all that it can be misunderstood.
Yes, yes. I think there's two ways I could respond to that, Mark. One way would be to if we think of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, these three elements. You've heard me use the analogy, probably on many occasions, the analogy of the actor John Smith, who plays the part of King Lear. So in this analogy, it's obviously a very limited analogy, but in this analogy, John Smith represents infinite consciousness, and King Lear represents a localization of that infinite consciousness, namely each of us apparent individuals. So here we have two apparent entities, just like we have John Smith, the actor, and King Lear, the part. We have apparently, we have infinite consciousness and the finite mind, or we have the individual and God's infinite being. And from the perspective of the individual, there seems to be an infinite distance between their self and God. The individual tends to project God at an infinite distance from their self. And then there has to be a pathway that connects them, a pathway of prayer, supplication, devotion, inquiry, whatever our pathway is. There must be some way of getting from the individual we imagine ourselves to be to the God that we deeply intuit is the ultimate reality. And this pathway, the means by which the apparent individual approaches the divine, I would see as the Holy Spirit, the inspiration by which the individual is taken to God's presence. Now, of course, in reality, there is no distance between King Lear and John Smith, because John Smith is the very being of King Lear. In fact, there isn't an individual being called King Lear. King Lear is just an imaginary and temporary limitation of the only person there truly is in the analogy John Smith. And in just the same way that I would suggest there are no individual beings, that there is no Son of God as an independently existing self. Jesus only referred to himself as the Son of God as a concession to those who believed themselves to be individual people. So it was as if he was saying, okay, for those of you that believe, which is of course most people, that you are an individual self, there is God the Father, there is God the Son, and then there is the path that we take from the individual to God's being. The Holy Spirit that enlightens the individual and reveals God's being. But of course, in reality, God's being is God's being, the Son is God's being, and the pathway from God's being to God's being is God's being. So in reality, these three, the one is only broken up into three as a concession to the one who believes themselves to be an individual. And it's legitimate and necessary to do so. But I think the understanding of the Trinity, or at least one way it can be understood, is that each of these three parts is in fact itself the whole, but just how the whole looks when it is viewed from the perspective of an individual. So that's not a direct correlation with your interpretation of the Trinity. It's a different way of viewing it, but it's not. I would suggest it was not that different.
I mean, I think it comes closest when you make the remark that, a bit like you did with the I am statements, that what if it seems like a separation, the pathway back is divine as much as what seemed like the separation is divine.
Yes. Yes.
And in fact, in traditional classical Trinitarian formula, it will talk about how the perichoresis would be the Greek word, that it's an interpenetration to such an extent that it's not even an interpenetration.
Yes.
That's the advantage of alluding to fancy Greek words.
Yes.
But yes, but it's trying to say something like that, I think.
The origin, the path, and the goal are all the same. The I am is both the origin, the path, and the goal. It is only appropriate and necessary to split it up into origin, path, and goal for one who believes that they are temporary and finite. It is in response to that apparently temporary finite self that the one is divided up into origin, path, and goal.
And another reason why I think this slightly metaphysical talk is worth having to some degree is because I think it can illuminate chapters 2 going forward, to go back to what you were saying there about after the realization as well, that it helps us understand a renewed experience of our individuality and this is, tell me whether this makes sense, but at the moment at least I'm sort of thinking of it as it's a kind of open individuality. Actually, well, there's a very nice analogy that I like from the Sufi tradition, which is that there's only one divine light, but it can reflect in myriad mirrors. Now, each mirror, when you look at it as if it were separate, looks like it's got this distinctive light, but seen from the whole, it's all the one light, in fact. And there's something about that, that delicate, that balance that is very enriching, actually, when you start to think about the experience of trying to live a life, but in the light of this awareness.
Yes, it's a beautiful analogy, because if each of our minds could be considered the numerous mirrors, then the light shining in each mirror is the light of God's being. So that the sense that each of us has, the absolute certainty that each of us has, I am. That knowledge of our own being, that awareness of being, is God's being shining not in us, because there is no us in which it could shine. It shines as us, as our sense of self. Although in most cases it is so mixed, our sense of our being is so mixed with the content of experience that it seems to have acquired its qualities and thus become limited.
That's very brilliant, that distinction there, I think, between shining in us and shining as us. That is the shift, and it's such a welcoming shift, because imaginatively it's so powerful and feels like a lure to want to move towards.
Yes, I think it's legitimate to say in the early stages of this investigation that God's being shines in us as the knowledge I am, or the awareness of being. And this, in a way, paves the way for the deeper understanding that God's being shines in us as our very own sense of ourself. There is no other self in us other than the self of God's being.
So if this is illuminating for us as individuals, in inverted commas, I wonder also about the social context and how this might have real meaning for the world in which we live. Just back up slightly, because one of the debates that interests me in the Advaita Vedanta tradition is about the nature of creation. Why Brahman is manifest in the created order, why we have to, as it were, talk about Brahman and Atman in the tradition. And my understanding, at least, and you know about this much more directly, but is that there are sort of, you might say, two strands of thought, and one has regarded the created order as illusion and its ignorance of the true nature of being that causes creation, or the appearance of creation. And the trouble with that understanding is that it seems to demean creation. And so you have the renunciate traditions that seem to withdraw as much from the world and maybe even decry the world and sort of negate it. But there is another way of thinking about this, which is that rather than creation being seen as Maya, as ignorance, that it's our awareness of the true nature of creation, which suffers from the ignorance, and that actually it's Brahman's, I think the word is lila, kind of playful expression, fullness, emanation would be a bit more of a Platonic word perhaps, but and this feels really valuable to me because we do live in a world that needs caring for, but we need a new way of trying to care for it. And I think there's something really important in understanding that it too is the manifestation of the divine.
Goodness, there's so much to unpack here, and it's a subject that's very close to my heart, Mark, because it's one that I wrestled with for so many years. And when I say so many years, I mean 20 years, because as I think you know, I was brought up in a classical school of Advaita Vedanta, which I loved, and that gave me this grounding in Indian philosophy. But there was some misunderstanding. I don't say the misunderstanding was in the original teaching, but it was certainly misunderstanding that I had. And I think it was possibly some misunderstanding that was also lost in translation. This idea, exactly as you say, this equating Maya with ignorance. That somehow the appearance of the world was due to ignorance and had to be got rid of. And this was something I struggled with, as I say, for 20 years, because I loved the world. I spent when I wasn't at home reading the Shankaracharya and Ramana Maharshi, I was in my studio making objects, making what I hoped would be beautiful objects. So I loved the earth, processes, materials, things. And at the same time, I was grappling with a philosophy that told me it didn't tell me, the interpretation, some people's interpretation suggested that the Maya, the appearance of things was due to ignorance and it had to be got rid of. And this, as you alluded to, gave rise to a very world negative view, a view that dismissed the world, dismissed the body, dismissed anything to do with the body's activities in the world. And I think it comes from a misunderstanding of what is meant by the word illusion. Normally, a sort of in common parlance, illusion refers to something that is not real, and something that is not real should be dispensed with. We don't take it seriously. You dream that you went that you were on holiday on a Caribbean beach. You wake up, and you forget the dream. It wasn't real. The waking state world you're living in is real. That was just a fantasy. It's an illusion in the sense that it wasn't real, and therefore should be dispensed with. That is the kind of normal understanding of the word illusion. Of course, illusion doesn't mean something that is not real. It means something that is real, but is not what it appears to be. So the Caribbean beach that we dream of course, it is real, but it's not a Caribbean beach made out of sand and water and sunshine. It's made out of the activity of your own mind. As the activity of your own mind, it is real. As a beach made out of sand and water, it is, of course, not real. So an illusion is not something that is non-existent. Something that is non-existent would be something like a square circle, something that cannot even exist as an illusion. It simply cannot exist in any form as an image, as an object. So if we understand illusion in this way, and we reinterpret what is meant by the world being an illusion. Yes, the world is an illusion in the sense that It is not what it appears to be. That doesn't mean that it's not real, and it certainly doesn't mean that it should be rejected or dispensed with. It just means that it's not what it appears to be. Well, quantum physics has been tells us that the world is not what it appears. We know that the world is not what it appears to be. What does it appear to be? A multiplicity and diversity of discrete objects and selves made out of dead inert stuff called matter. That's what it appears. That's what the evidence of the senses tell us. But we know that that is not the case. So the world as a multiplicity and diversity of discrete objects is an illusion, but all illusions have a reality to them. And if we are experiencing an illusion, we are by definition experiencing its reality. You're seeing my face at the moment, but if you touch my face, you won't find my face, but you will find the screen. And in fact, you cannot, which relatively speaking, is the reality of my face at the moment. So if you are experiencing my face, you are by definition experiencing its reality, relatively speaking, the screen. So it's not Maya. It's not the illusion that is the problem. Because as I say, when you're seeing an illusion, you are by definition seeing its reality. If you're seeing a mirage in the desert, you are by definition seeing the light of which it is a play. The light is not concealed behind the mirage. It shines as the mirage. The screen that you're looking at now is not concealed behind my face. It shines as my face. So it's not the illusion that is the problem. It's the ignorance that is the problem. It is the belief that what you're looking at is a real face. It is the belief that the mirage in the desert is made out of water. It is the belief that the world is made out of dead inert stuff called matter. That's what's referred to as ignorance in the Vedantic tradition. And it is ignorance that is problematic, not Maya. In fact, on what is traditionally referred to as enlightenment or awakening or salvation, the illusion doesn't disappear. The illusion remains. We can be sure that if Jesus or the Buddha or Lao Tzu were sitting next to us now, they would be seeing exactly the same world that we are seeing. The world would appear as an illusion to them, but they would see through that illusion because the illusion is no longer accompanied by ignorance, which is the belief that that world is made out of something other than their essential being. So I think, so you're right. Once the correspondence between Maya, the illusion, and ignorance has been clearly analyzed, we then have we can then think of Maya in a broader way, a little bit like you described Lila. It is then the word Maya. In fact, there are two ways of translating the word Maya. One is illusion, but the other is closer to your Lila, creative display. So the world is no longer seen as an illusion in a negative sense. It is a display, an appearance of the one reality made of infinite consciousness. It is a creative display of that reality, and is not something to be rejected. On the contrary, it is something to be treasured, to be valued, to be loved, not as a multiplicity and diversity of objects and selves, but to be loved. Why? Because it is an appearance of the one thing that truly is. It should be loved of that, because if one rejects that, well, to reject that in favor of another reality, there we're in duality. And the inevitable consequence of that duality, sooner or later, is suffering on the inside and conflict on the outside.
Yeah, that's very well put. How dualities can return even in the pursuit of the unity.
Exactly. If we reject the world in favor of an imagined reality that is somehow beyond it, then that duality, if we pursue that duality far enough, will eventually inevitably come back to the consequences of duality, which are always suffering on the inside and conflict on the outside.
Reminds me of another well-known remark of William Blake's as well, about when he has this inner dialogue and someone says to him, when you see the sun, do you see a round guinea in the sky?
Around disc
Says,
of
no, no,
fire,
no.
somewhat like a guinea. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so he says, no, 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 I see the company of the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy. And it's the illusion looks the same, but he, as it were, can see through the illusion, or maybe what it's actually transmitting. Again, the doors of perception have been cleaned, and
Yes.
so everything finite shines with the infinite.
Absolutely, absolutely. And going back to that beautiful quote of Blake's that you initially quoted, that every bird that cuts the airy way, every bird that flies in the sky is an immense world of delight, enclosed by the senses. By this idea that sense perception, the faculties of seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, clothe reality, the infinite reality whose nature is joy, with their own limitations, and makes it appear as, in this case, a bird flying through the sky. But what we're really witnessing is in religious language, that the divine reality, the one reality, enclosed by sense perception. It is sense perception that clothes that reality and makes that reality appear in accordance with its own limitations. It's the beautiful thing that Wordsworth said somewhere in the prelude, where he alludes to the world, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive. This idea that we half create the world, half perceive it. And this is an idea that's very important, because in some more radical or fundamentalist expressions of the so-called non-dual understanding, the world is considered just a projection of our own finite minds. And of course, if we follow that idea all the way, you end up with solipsism. But this beautiful idea of William Blake's, that the world is both half created by us and half perceived. So it's half created in the sense that the faculties through which we perceive the world, namely sense perception, lend their own limitations, confer their own limitations on the reality of the world, and makes that reality appear in a way that is consistent with those limitations. But the reality of the world exists independent of and prior to the limitations that the finite mind imposes on that world. So what we perceive as this world of multiplicity and diversity is its essence is the pre-existing reality, infinite consciousness. But the form in which we see it is due to the lens of perception through which it is perceived.
Makes me think of other experiences that become very different. So, for example, the experience of otherness could become an experience of the expansiveness of the infinite that we share in, and maybe the experience of separateness comes to be seen as the loving connection. In fact, that a lot of these things that they can be reimagined and then entered into.
Yes. Yes.
In the Wordsworth line, the part creating is also the path back to the true perception.
Yes. What is the one thing that a separate self seeks? It is happiness on the inside, but love on the outside. And all people's activities are almost all our activities are governed by the desire to either find happiness on the inside and love on the outside, or to express them. So I think there is this, once infinite consciousness has contracted into an apparent individual, there is this irrepressible urge in the apparent individual to return to its natural state of equilibrium, which is experienced on the inside as happiness and on the outside as as love, and that is why we all love love. We all when we feel our separateness at its most intense, we call it loneliness, we call it depression, because that is an intense version of the sense of separation. What is the opposite of loneliness? Love. What is the opposite of depression? Happiness. These are two experiences in which the separateness of the separate self is, at least to a degree, dissolved, and reality shines. It shines on the inside as peace or joy, and it shines on the outside as love or beauty.
Yeah. Let me take another kind of circle around all this and hope that it's illuminating. I've been thinking a lot about Dante this year, partly because it's the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And I'm kind of hoping that the Divine Comedy might be another expression in the Western tradition of this non-dual vision. That partly because I think it was written at a time when the modern sense of self was just beginning actually to be born, and very often when you read texts that are, or look at works of art that are from at the moment of origin, it helps remake a connection rather than further down the line when the separation and so on has become very entrenched. But what's so striking? Well, there's a couple of things striking. One thing is, with the anniversary, I've been looking at for what people have been writing and writing a bit myself. And it's quite a common remark nowadays to say, well, we kind of understand the inferno because we get suffering. We sort of get a bit of the purgatory because it feels a bit therapeutic, like things are changing. But goodness me, the paradise, we don't understand that. And it's so distressing, really, when people say that, because I think the inferno is, in a way, a description of life when people feel radically separate and get caught up in a kind of repetition compulsion that just absorbs them from the past, and there's no present, so therefore there's no change. Whereas the paradise, I think, is when Dante actually, in a way, he has the realization now. Virgil, at the top of Mount Purgatory, crowns him lord and mitre of himself. And it's kind of saying, look, Dante, you've seen clearly that your being and God's being is one being now. Now we really get going. Now we can really start to live. And so we enter the paradise. And there's a number of wonderful things that, apart from it being kind of a Western tradition that therefore might be quite relatable for people, there's so many little details in the paradise which I felt very helpful in terms of thinking about growing into this way. So, for example, when Dante's in paradise, one of the things he discovers is that he recognizes souls, he recognizes people that he knew when he was on Earth. So they still have their sense of who they are, and yet they shine more and more brightly with the divine sense too. And there's something really important about those things coming together in the paradise. He describes, and Beatrice leads him as she can, almost kind of titrating with each step of the way, a bit more divine effulgence that doesn't blast the individual, but makes them shine all the more brightly. So yeah. You're nodding. That sort of makes sense.
I like the way you describe it very much, because it is not, in a way, that this understanding is not a negation of the individual. It's not a suppression or a denial of the individual. It's as you are implying, and as Dante implied, it is an outshining of the individual with God's being. So the individual is not diminished. It is expanded and magnified rather than crushed and diminished. And I think some of the in some of the traditions, the separate self is given, because it is seen ultimately to be an illusion. It is crushed and denied, and as you said earlier, judged to be sinful. Whereas I think in the true non-dual understanding, and certainly in the understanding that you're referring to in Dante, the individual is transfigured, is magnified, is not diminished, and retains all of its individuality, which are then whose qualities are then used in the service of the divine, so that the individual is transfigured from the inside out and uses their faculties in the service of the divine, no longer in service of the individual, which in less religious language would mean in service of love and intelligence, rather than in the service of division and conflict and hatred.
Yeah, it brings to my mind a lot of words that I think we have come to misunderstand. So, for example, the nature of our freedom. Very commonly, and actually this is quite commonly in Christianity too, is interpreted as an expression of my will. And of course, that inevitably conflicts with someone else's will. But I think Dante was very clear, and I think the true understanding is that our freedom actually is precisely the gift of being able to shine more brightly with what's good, beautiful, and true. And because it's the fullest expression of being that can possibly be, if one can put it like that, it's free.
Yes.
And that's the invitation, that's the vision.
Yes, exactly. Again, in some expressions of the traditional and contemporary expressions of the non-dual understanding, that there is this denial of the individual's freedom. But actually, to deny the individual's freedom is first of all to assert the existence of the individual, and then to say that individual has no freedom. No, if we simply realize that the individual is just a temporary and an apparent limitation of the only one that truly is, then the one that truly is, infinite consciousness, God's being, whatever we call it, is freedom itself. And that's why we all feel that we have freedom. And it's certainly why we all love freedom, because we all love ourselves, not ourselves as an individual, but we all love our being, the only being there is. And we feel free, and we don't like our freedom to be taken away from us. We feel that our freedom is our birthright. It's not something we should earn through merit. We feel it is our birthright. It is our birthright. It is the very nature of ourselves, not as individuals, but as infinite consciousness. So again, I agree with you that this emphasis and celebration of freedom, not a denial of it or a diminishing of it.
And then another thing which I've taken quite a lot of comfort in, actually, from Dante, even in Paradise, is that it can still be quite a struggle. It can still be difficult. He can still make mistakes, but strangely, they're not mistakes that separate him from the divine presence, but they're mistakes that tip him further into the divine presence.
Yes. Yes. I think that's so true, Mark. I think, and again, this is something that I misunderstood for many, many years, that somehow on recognizing the nature of our essential self, we suddenly become perfect human beings, and we don't struggle with anything or anyone anymore. But of course, the entire structure of the way we think and feel remains in place and needs to be gradually colonized by or suffused with this understanding. And it doesn't mean that we don't encounter these difficulties, but for one who is for one with this understanding, these difficulties, as you say, that they are opportunities to further align all aspects of ourself with this understanding. So they're not considered in a negative light, but that doesn't mean to say they're not difficult. They may well still be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Dante says this is actually the most difficult leg of the journey. Stay close behind my bark. He imagines himself sort of sailing
Yes,
through oceans of eternity. But I think it's important to stress as well, because you know, there's something about me at least that kind of wants a challenge in this. I want to feel a sense of true growth, you might say, not material accumulative growth, but
yes.
the growth of the spirit. And so I find it quite inviting at the end of the day.
Yes, and I think, Mark, this goes back to what you said earlier about the function of therapy in this process, but both as a means of stabilizing the mind as it begins to trace its way back through the layers of experience, but also after this recognition of the nature of our being, that therapy can be used to explore these matters, explore the residues of thoughts, feelings, activities, relationships that still exist, that still function on the old operating system, that have yet to be upgraded by this new understanding. And therapy can facilitate that realignment process. And
Yeah,
I think that as this understanding begins to infiltrate deeper and deeper into society, outside just the relatively small non-dual and even the spiritual community, but to find its way into broader and larger areas of the community, I think that it will be incorporated into some therapeutic practice, as I've no doubt that you are doing. I know a number of people who are deeply interested in these matters and who are practicing therapists, and their tools have been refined and by this understanding, and they've incorporated this understanding, both the investigative part of it, the part of it whereby we explore our true nature, but also the means by which it is expressed in our lives through our thoughts, feelings, activities, and relationships. And I think that this will happen more and more, that therapeutic practice will, for many therapists, incorporate this understanding.
yeah, I actually think it's quite necessary, because if you don't
Absolutely,
have
yeah.
the understanding, then there's a kind of escalation of therapeutic techniques, because in a way there's always another trouble to pay attention to if you want to, much like if you go to church, there's always another sin to confess. But I think increasingly myself that the goal really is to um, have enough understanding of your seemingly separate self, which paradoxically is to start to see it's not so separate, in fact. And so to move as soon as possible almost to introducing that wider understanding gives
Yes,
therapy a proper telos, a proper goal.
exactly. Yes, and that, of course, as you know much better than I do from your practice as therapist, that of course is where the it's not just skill; it's really where the art of therapy lies, and where you can't rely on just a tool bag full of techniques and practices. It requires great sensitivity, great listening, to know exactly to what extent you can share this understanding of our essential nature, and to what extent you need to pause and deal with the more relative issues that are at hand before being able to take the step all the way back into our being. And that it differs not only from client to client, but it also at different times of the conversation that you're having with them. And that's really where the art of therapy, I think, really comes in, that quality of listening and the intuition to know how much to say, how much to push, how much to hold back, how much to invite, how much to suggest. Um,
Yeah, no, I mean, and I see it too in your teaching as well, that
it's the
the art
same.
of, yeah, of what's the next step, what's the next unveiling.
It's the same. It's the same thing. We don't just answer every question with, oh, there's nobody here, there's nothing to do, or forget all of that, just investigate who is the I. It's more subtle than that. To some people, yes, at some time, it's appropriate to say there's nobody here, there's nothing to do. At another occasion, it's appropriate to say, investigate the one on whose behalf your feeling arises. But these are not techniques to be used in reference. They need to come spontaneously in the moment. And there are all sorts of other possible responses that may be appropriate that perhaps that aren't so radical, but they're still informed by the same understanding, but they're tailored to the understanding of the person that you're speaking to, and may just involve taking one small step back in the right direction, not going all the way back.
Yeah, Plato makes this remark where he says that what we're talking about is not like water that can be poured from a jug into a glass, as if this knowledge can be kind of poured into your head or your heart even. It's a participation. It's a dynamic interpenetration or growth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'm sure that when you see a client in a therapy session, you come to the session empty. You don't come with preconceived ideas. You come empty and open, and you listen and you follow. I do exactly the same. If I'm doing a retreat or a meeting, I come just open, and then we take off in a particular direction in response to a question.
Yeah, it's this strange process whereby you undergo training and you perhaps learn quite deeply certain traditions, certain models, but it's so that they can be almost forgotten. But in the forgetting of them, you become alert to, you might even say the intelligence that the models and so on were born from.
Exactly.
That you've been initiated into them almost.
Exactly. Because if you don't forget them, there isn't the space in you for creating new pathways. And although the understanding is always the same, it's been the same for thousands of years, the pathways that are developed in response to our questions and objections always need to develop. And so there needs to be creativity and spontaneity in a response, either to an individual or to a group. And if you hold on to all the methods, the practices, the ideas that you inherited from your teacher or for your training, then the best you can do is simply represent them. But that creates a dead religion. It's not, in the end, it's not nourishing. It doesn't lead to the real understanding.
To use a Christian expression, to come to life in all its fullness.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
But we've covered a lot of ground, and I've been very grateful for it, because it's helped me, I think, connect up ideas that have been in my mind, not least from listening to a lot of your talks, participating in the retreats, and so on. I feel encouraged that this very much can become a richer presence within the Christian tradition as well as in the Advaita tradition. Maybe we're all a bit of a mix of traditions. That's part of what it is to be a modern person. So it's good to make these links. And
absolutely, absolutely. And Mark, I wanted to say also, I'm halfway through listening to your really wonderful podcast on Dante. I love it. In fact, during lockdown, I would go out every night walking the deserted, empty, beautiful streets of Austin, and I was often accompanied by your podcasts on Dante. And then I paused for a while when I was writing a book, but I'll resume them again. I think they're really wonderful. So maybe there's another conversation to be had there. But I think your commentary is. I love your interpretation and the way you kind of walk the listener. You kind of walk alongside Dante and the listener. They're really very much enjoying them.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was engaged with the Divine Comedy, not least while listening and reading your own material and work and watching things online. So it's a very rich synthesis for me, in fact. So I appreciate it very much. Just say to people where they can find more about your work as well,
Well,
if don't know already.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Two places really. YouTube, go to my YouTube channel. There are, I don't know how many clips now, but several hundred, I think. So that's one place to go, just a lot of free clips, conversations, meditations. And then my website, rupertspira.com, where everything else, my books, events, and so on.
And maybe just to add that if people were interested in picking up any threads that I might be able to offer, then I too have a website, markvernon.com, and links to the podcast can be found there as well. But Rupert, thank you. It's a real joy to try and share these things, feel these things, and then articulate them in the hope that they ripple out to people. So I do appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you. You're right. It is a real joy. It's there's something very magical that happens when two minds come together that have been fashioned in slightly different traditions, but obviously are deeply interested in the same thing and come together and have a conversation. There's something very, very beautiful and magical happens. So I very much enjoyed this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.